There are a ton of cliche phrases in the fight game. Don't leave it out of the hands of the judges, so-and-so has never fought anybody like me, there's always a puncher's chance, oh my god, Jason on point is so much better than Tom on point, anything can happen in MMA, and of course, styles make fights. And for the most part, that last saying is incredibly accurate. Diego Sanchez versus Clay Guida, barring some sort of freak accident, is always going to be a barn burner, while Adesanya versus Anderson Silva was a guaranteed intricate and flashy striking affair. But on rare occasions, matchups that have fans drooling in anticipation, such as Francis Ngannou versus Derek Lewis, ended up being a total dud. Thankfully, this also works in reverse too, and contests with very little hope on paper end up having the fight of the night honors, and others are even among the greatest ever. I'm Jason from MMA On Point, and these are 10 incredible fights fans actually thought would suck. Number 10, Tony Ferguson versus Kevin Lee. While the undisputed lightweight champion was then pursuing Floyd Mayweather money, Khabib and Tony were set to meet and rightfully establish the division's #1 contender. Of course, that would only be the third time it would fall through back in 2017, this time allegedly and infamously due to tiramisu on Khabib's end. So instead, Ferguson was rather bizarrely booked against the number 7th ranked 155er Kevin Lee for the interim title. Sure, Lee was making a name for himself in the division following his slightly controversial submission over Michael Chiesa, but fighting Ferguson with the belt on the line was a substantial jump up the ladder. It just felt like too much too soon with an interim title slapped on it because they wanted to somehow increase pay-per-view sales. On one hand, it's not that terrible, we were after all getting an El Kukui fight, but it wasn't an ultra-competitive title matchup on paper that fans really wanted to see, especially with a Khabib fight out there, and it didn't really appear to be a serious test for Ferguson, especially considering Lee's glaringly obvious staph infection. But the bout itself was fantastic, even by Ferguson's lofty standards. Knockdowns were exchanged, Kevin Lee secured seriously dominant positions early on, but in the end, Lee succumbed to a triangle choke after presumably in part gassing out from his staph infection, leaving many to wonder what a potential rematch would look like down the line without such a debilitating illness. Number 9, Stipe Miocic versus Daniel Cormier 2. Stepping away from John Jones's shadow and winning the UFC's heavyweight title was arguably the best thing to ever happen to DC in his long and storied career. Once he knocked out Miocic inside the first round in the first contest, no longer could fans see the Jones absence as a means to discredit Cormier's accomplishments. He'd done something outside of it, and he happened to KO the man with the most consecutive heavyweight title defenses ever. A potential circus bout with Brock Lesnar was teased, but after falling through, the focus for many shifted to a third possible fight with Jones at heavyweight, and most overlooking Stipe as a viable rematch. But instead, that's exactly what happened. The Stipe rematch was agreed upon once it was clear the big money fight was off the table with Lesnar's retirement, but nothing from the first encounter itself generally suggested this needed to be ran back immediately, at least for Stipe, who hadn't fought anybody else. But Stipe knew it needed to happen, and it was ultimately given to him on the basis of the aforementioned holding of the most consecutive heavyweight title defenses in UFC history. So they definitely had the past between the two, but with such a definitive result in the rearview mirror, there was far less hype this time than their initial matchup. But by all accounts, that first fight would be totally eclipsed, with an incredible pace that resembled a flyweight fight rather than fighting at heavyweight. Stipe withstood relentless wrestling in the first and bomb after bomb in the rounds that followed, until the adjustment was made in the fourth to target Cormier's body with what turned out to be a historic comeback, cementing the two as forever of the best of competitive rivals. And one hell of a fight. Number 8, Demetrius Johnson versus Tim Elliott. Season 24 The Ultimate Fighter was definitely a fun idea. 16 flyweight champions from various outside promotions, with the eventual winner getting a crack at UFC champion Demetrius Johnson, who was desperate for a new opponent. But in reality, no one saw the winner as a real and true credible threat regardless of who it was, and especially among the hardcore community, TUF itself had already long been considered a tired format for quite some time. So were fans excited? Well, considering the small arena that did not sell out and low TV ratings, the resounding answer was no, especially when that person ended up being someone UFC fans had seen less than 2 years prior getting cut following 3 straight losses. The overwhelming consensus was that this would be an easy opportunity for a prime DJ to stack yet another title defense on his mantle. But Tim Elliott's wacky, unorthodox style transformed the fight into a scintillating grappling affair. Elliott shockingly almost pulled off the impossible with an early submission, something no one had even been close to doing against the champion in years prior. In the the end, DJ showed his control and composure, resulting in a unanimous decision. But the wild moments of this fight made for incredible viewing and nearly became one of the biggest upsets in MMA's entire history. Number 7. TJ Dillashaw versus Renan BARAO 1. The landscape of the bantamweight division was a vastly different place back in 2014 to how it's looked recently. Pre-sanctioned EPO, Dillashaw wasn't recognized as championship caliber yet when he was just on a one-fight win streak, while Renan BARAO, who's drastically struggled as of late, was the ultra-dominant king at 135 in Dominick Cruz's injury-stricken absence. The Brazilian was unbeaten in 33 straight fights since his debut in 2005, with 2 recent victories over TJ's then mentor Uriah Faber. So when Dillashaw was pulled from a matchup with fellow prospect Takeya Mizugaki to face one of the pound-for-pound greats after going 1-1 in his last 2, there was essentially no excitement for the matchup. Fans would have congratulated the Team Alpha Male fighter on simply surviving a couple of rounds with BARAO. It's about as unheralded as a title challenger can be. As fate would have it though, the unsuspecting, unproven contender didn't just win, but utterly dismantled the champion from the beginning all the way up until a 5th round finish. It was one of the most incredible, flawless performances from a title challenger in UFC history, making for an unbelievable, memorable fight and a performance that really no one saw coming. Number 6. Jon Jones versus Dominick Reyes. Ooh, this one's a bit fresh, isn't it? Whether you agree with the decision or not, you can't disagree that this was an incredible fight. And whether you hate Jones or not, the long-standing light heavyweight champion has been the 205-pound king for a near decade, albeit with plenty of forced absences in there. But when you look into his record, it would genuinely take up way too much time to chronicle all of his title defenses here. Interestingly enough, much of Jones' toughest and most exciting title defenses have come by way of truly lesser hyped opponents. The first fight with Alexander Gustafsson was incredible, but most thought back then that it was just being overhyped based on their height comparisons, because finally they had something to compare to Jones. Another example is the brutal contest he had against a former 185-pounder in Thiago Santos that saw him lose on at least one judge's scorecard, but even more so than all the others, it was his latest bout with Dominick Reyes that had fans on the edge of their seat. In the build-up to UFC 247, Reyes, who only transitioned to martial arts when Jon was already in the midst of his championship reign, was essentially dismissed as having very little to offer aside from a big left hand that many believed Jones would easily avoid. The frustration about this was palpable in Dominick's interviews leading up to the fight, as the masses were quick to count him out. But when fight night came around, not only did Reyes deserve to be in there as he would quickly prove, but a large segment of fans and media believed that Reyes deserved the title win. There are plenty of people arguing for Jones as well, but regardless of your view on the controversial decision, there is no doubt that this was one amazing fight. Number 5. Randy Couture versus, well, everyone? No one in MMA has defied the logic of what an aging fighter can do more than this man. Countless times Couture has seemingly been destined to lose, and often the grizzled vet has found a way to inconceivably defy the odds against him. From stopping a young and enigmatic Vitor Belfort in 1997 to remarkably dominating the stand-up against Chuck Liddell and out-wrestled a prime Tito, Randy has made a career out of putting on stunning performances when most thought it to be impossible. But perhaps the fight with the least expectation that gave us the most excitement was undoubtedly his heavyweight title victory over Tim Sylvia at UFC 68. On paper, Randy had no chance. He was 43, coming out of retirement, giving up 6 inches in height and over 40 pounds with a near foot reach disadvantage. Sure, it was nice to see the legend back, but it looked to be a straightforward win for the fresh champion, and in a merciless sport like MMA that feeds the old legends to young contenders every day, the expectation wasn't that of a heartwarming, odd-breaking comeback, but rather most expected a sad decapitation. Of course though, this entire notion was disproven nearly the instant the fight started, as Couture dropped the giant with his first punch and dominated Sylvia for all 5 rounds, leaving the crowd in utter hysteria. 50-45s were read out across the board, and Joe Rogan said it best:
"That was the most incredible thing that I've ever seen in my life."
Number 4. Kamaru Usman versus Colby Covington. 2019 was a wild ride for the welterweight division. A new champion was crowned, a BMF title was created to culminate Jorge Masvidal's ridiculous year with the help of Nate Diaz, while prospects gave us a potential glimpse of what may be to come. But the very final 170-pound matchup of the decade for the promotion between Kamaru Usman and Colby Covington was one of the most entertaining title fights you could ever ask for. Yes, there was legitimate competitive anticipation to see who'd come out on top as 2 men at the uppermost echelon of the division, division, but considering it was being contested between two wrestlers, neither of which are particularly known to get into brawls, it was very much expected to be more about whose wrestling style could outfox the other instead of a total all-out war. And so when you look back, fans basically felt the bout itself was likely to be a wrestling snooze fest, with little striking on display and most of the hype being around what it meant for the division and the personas involved. Once the octagon door slammed shut though, both men completely ditched their grappling credentials, and from the first exchange all the way up to the last minute TKO, both men went toe to toe, literally throwing jaw-shattering strikes in what was no doubt one of the most intense title fights in recent history. Colby said after the fact that his jaw wasn't broken, but that might just be a part of his character, as his own photos posted a couple days after show the x-rays of the gruesome break. Number 3, Mauricio Shogun Rua versus Dan Henderson. There's nothing worse in combat sports than fights that happen too late. Floyd Mayweather versus Manny Pacquiao so far past their prime still bugs many to this day. Charlie, when writing this script, originally imagined a place in which two men in the lightweight division never fight in their prime, but we won't verbally speak of anything that horrific. Nope.
The power of Christ compels you.
This matchup at their ages was certainly not quite as horrible to that extent, but Shogun Rua versus Dan Henderson was much later in their careers than when either man would arguably be considered their best. Hendo was the Pride double champ, while Shogun was a straight assassin under the Japanese organization with that 2005 Grand Prix victory. So a fight between the two, especially back then, would have been colossal. But by now, Dan was 41 and Shogun had seemingly lost his step after a pair of knee surgeries and a title loss. Of course, Hendo was actually in a great position after Strikeforce, and this fight would earn him a title shot just because of how incredible it was. By the end of it though, their blood-stained white shorts proved just how obviously wrong that view was. Each fighter was on the brink of being finished numerous times, and it was Hendo's early work that earned him likely the hardest fought decision of his whole career. It was only the second time a non-title bout main event was scheduled for 5 rounds, Lieben and Munoz being the first. And now the bout resides in the Hall of Fame, where both individuals will surely earn induction for their full careers in the years to come. Number 2, Frankie Edgar versus Gray Maynard 2. The two wars these men went through are some of the most memorable lightweight title fights in history, and rightfully so. But what's less spoken about is their very first matchup when Edgar and Maynard were just unbeaten up-and-comers. It was a solid 3-rounder, mind you, with Gray unanimously winning with his NCAA Division I caliber wrestling, but it also wasn't any sort of indication that fans should be salivating for the rematch either. Less than 3 years later though, the two were meeting up again for the 155-pound title on New Year's Day in 2011. Considering the pair had just a single finish in their last 15 combined fights, the element of danger was pretty well slept on here. Frankie was deemed too small for lightweight despite being champion, which made him all that much more impressive, and Maynard was perceived as a super talented and undefeated wrestler who could potentially prove too physically strong for Edgar yet again and probably coast to another decision, this time of course over 5 rounds. As we all know by now, the rematch was in complete stark contrast to the first, with the opening round being one of the wildest ever. For almost 4 whole minutes, the challenger was battering the champion around the octagon, and to this day, you still can't even now fathom how he managed to survive, let alone galvanize the energy to squeeze out a draw. It was many outlets' fight of the year, and they even had the pleasure to put on a crazy third fight, this time with the hype fully understood, where Edgar scored a 4th round knockout after weathering an early storm again to end one of MMA's greatest trilogies. Number 1, Robbie Lawler versus Rory MacDonald 2. No, really. Even this, one of the greatest title fights in the sport's entire history, actually had very little excitement going into it. There's a few reasons for this. Foremost, their initial matchup that Robbie won by split decision just over 2 years prior wasn't really that exciting. It did have a pretty fun 3rd round with Lawler putting on the pressure, but the previous rounds were genuinely rather dull as the crowd booed Rory's top game, which nullified much of Lawler's striking. On top of this, the rematch was massively overshadowed as the lead up to the event that was all eyes on McGregor Aldo after the World Tour, which still continued when Chad Mendes had to step up on late notice, to which MacDonald and Lawler both admitted to enjoying the lack of spotlight, even relishing in the deferred attention when asked about it. Rory also had a bit of a point scoring connotation attached to his name by this point, so in addition to the knowledge of the first fight, fans weren't predicting the war that would unfold when they met again, this time for the welterweight title. But for just over 4 rounds, Lawler and MacDonald battled back and forth in 2015's fight of the year, and what many consider considered to be the best title fight ever. The Red King became quite literally the embodiment of his moniker, as both he and Robbie were dripping with blood onto the canvas until finally the Canadian's nose couldn't take any more punishment and put an end to one of the grittiest battles this sport has ever produced. I'd like to give a massive shout out to Charlie Howard for helping me write this list. You can give him a follow on Twitter at MMA_Charlie. And then of course Max Randall, who's just getting back from covering the New Zealand card in Auckland and is jumping right onto another edit. You are the real MVP.
He's talking about me.
You can follow him on Twitter at Max_Randall. Thanks for watching my list, guys. If you enjoyed the video, subscribe and like. We upload at least 3 videos per week about MMA, and it really helps us out when you do so. If I missed anything on this vid, let me know in the comments, and feel free to follow me on Twitter at JasonTheHeart, or follow the official channel account at OnPointMMA. Thanks for watching so much, and I'll catch you on the next video.